Why did the French Revolution succeed? The success of the French Revolution, a transformative epic that permanently scarred the social and political landscape of the Western world, was not an accident or a spontaneous street riot. It was the catastrophic and long-anticipated result of the explosive convergence of deeply rooted systemic failures, profound intellectual shifts, and an unprecedented degree of governmental and aristocratic incompetence. The revolution succeeded because the Ancien Régime, the ancient political and social structure of pre-revolutionary France, had become so brittle, so inherently contradictory, and so utterly divorced from economic reality that it was structurally incapable of adapting to the demands of a rapidly modernizing world. What occurred was not merely a change of government, but a societal collapse rooted in a fundamental disconnect between the nation's immense potential wealth and the crown's chronic inability to harness it effectively. The first and most critical reason for the revolution's success lies in the utter collapse of the old order's ability to finance and sustain itself. France, under the Bourbon kings, was a paradox, a nation rich in population, fertile land, and cultural influence, but crippled by a deeply antiquated system of privilege and taxation. The most immediate cause of success was the state's terminal bankruptcy, a reality that had haunted the halls of Versailles for decades. France was perpetually insolvent, having engaged in costly and often fruitless wars throughout the entire 18th century. The two major expenditures that had bled the treasury dry were the devastating 7 Years' War, which resulted in territorial losses, and, critically, the American War of Independence. King Louis XVI's enthusiastic decision to heavily fund the American rebels was politically motivated, a strategy to spite France's ancient rival Great Britain, but it was financially suicidal. The borrowing became endemic and the national debt spiraled terrifyingly out of control, reaching unsustainable levels by the 1880s. Compounding this existential financial crisis was the disastrous taxation system, a relic of the feudal past that made any sensible fiscal solution impossible. The nobility and the clergy, the two wealthiest estates in the realm, enjoyed sweeping and fiercely protected exemptions from the main direct tax, the taille, and numerous other financial obligations.
The entire financial burden of maintaining the army, the court, the bureaucracy, and servicing the enormous national debt fell disproportionately and mercilessly upon the Third Estate, particularly the impoverished peasantry and the burgeoning class of merchants and professionals, the bourgeoisie. Any attempt by royal finance ministers, like the brilliant Anne Robert Jacques Turgot or the popular Swiss banker Jacques Necker, to reform this archaic system by imposing fair taxes on the privileged classes was met with a fierce, unyielding, and organized resistance from the powerful regional judicial bodies known as the Parlement and the deeply entrenched aristocratic elite. The king theoretically possessed absolute power, but he was rendered utterly powerless against the stone wall of aristocratic self-interest and privilege. When the state treasury finally emptied, the king had nowhere left to turn. This financial abyss forced him to take the unprecedented and politically fatal step of summoning the Estates General in May 1789, a legislative body that had not met for 175 years. This act was not a show of strength, it was a public admission of the monarchy's ultimate failure of control and the end of its absolute rule. The inherent social rigidity of the French system also provided an essential catalyst for the revolution's success. French society was rigidly divided into 3 distinct estates, a structure that had become economically meaningless but politically explosive and highly volatile. The first estate was the clergy, who owned substantial tax-exempt land and collected tithes. The second estate was the nobility, who held almost all key positions of power in the military, government, and church, controlled vast hereditary estates and were largely exempt from the most painful taxation. Their power was not based on merit but lineage, and this created a source of deep, bitter resentment from the meritocratic class below them. The Third Estate, which constituted approximately 97% of the entire population, was a vast and deeply varied group. This majority included the impoverished peasantry, who bore the weight of ancient feudal dues, the urban working class, the sans-culottes, who faced chronic unemployment and starvation, and most crucially, the highly educated and rapidly growing wealthy bourgeoisie. This last group, the bourgeoisie, was the veritable economic engine of France.
They were doctors, lawyers, merchants, bankers, and industrialists, educated in Enlightenment philosophy, and possessed of the administrative skill and wealth to effectively run the nation. Yet they were systematically and humiliatingly shut out of political power and denied the social status they felt they deserved simply due to their lack of aristocratic lineage. Their profound sense of thwarted ambition and intellectual justification provided the coherent fuel for the revolution's leadership. The strategic success of the revolution hinged entirely on the unprecedented and fragile alliance of the bourgeoisie and the urban working class. The bourgeoisie provided the indispensable leadership, the sophisticated ideology, and the legal framework necessary to dismantle the old order and construct a new one. Conversely, the sans-culottes provided the overwhelming manpower, the revolutionary street violence, and the crucial intimidating force necessary to coerce the crown and the privileged classes into submission. Without the intellectual blueprint of the bourgeoisie, the mobs would have been mere riots. Without the physical force of the sans-culottes, the ideals of the bourgeoisie would have been dismissed as mere political theory. The intellectual ideas of the Age of Enlightenment did not directly cause the revolution, for revolutions are made of economic and social misery, not solely of books. However, these ideas provided the philosophical blueprint and the radical revolutionary language that allowed the Third Estate to rationalize and justify the complete and total demolition of the existing political order. Philosophers provided the ultimate weapons. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the general will, the idea that true political sovereignty resides in the collective will of the people and not in the monarch directly, shattered the foundation of the divine right of kings. John Locke's ideas on natural rights and the theory that government is based on a voluntary social contract were codified directly and powerfully in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which served as the revolution's sacred text. Montesquieu's theories on the separation of powers pushed for a constitutional system with checks and balances against the dangerously concentrated power of the monarchy.
These highly critical ideas circulated widely and rapidly through numerous channels including literary salons, coffee houses, and mass-produced printed pamphlets, creating a powerful public sphere where the very legitimacy of the monarchy and the aristocracy was constantly debated and openly questioned. By 1789, the educated classes had already mentally and philosophically dismantled the Austrian regime. They were simply waiting for the opportunity provided by financial collapse to carry out the physical construction of a new republican reality. The revolution's irreversible success was profoundly aided by a series of catastrophic political and personal miscalculations made by the royal family and the entrenched aristocracy. King Louis XVI was personally a well-meaning man, but historically he proved to be a tragically weak and indecisive ruler, utterly incapable of the swift, decisive action necessary to navigate a national crisis of this unprecedented magnitude. His constant hesitation and inability to choose definitively between reform and repression served only to embolden the revolutionaries at every turn. His initial attempts to intimidate the National Assembly by concentrating foreign mercenary troops around Paris in July 1789 were perceived not as a show of force, but as an act of treachery. This deliberate provocation fueled the masses, leading directly to the pivotal storming of the Bastille. This event was a turning point. It showed the king that the streets of his capital no longer belonged to him, but had been decisively seized by the armed people. He lost the political initiative entirely, and he was never able to regain it. The most profound and disastrous error committed by the monarchy was the flight to Varennes in June 1791. By attempting to secretly flee Paris and join counter-revolutionary forces amassed near the border, Louis XVI systematically destroyed any remaining public trust in the monarchy and irrevocably shattered the possibility of a workable constitutional settlement. His flight demonstrated unequivocally to the masses that he was not merely a reluctant king, but a traitor actively plotting war against his own nation and people. This single desperate act radicalized public opinion, shifted the mood entirely and permanently towards republicanism, and ultimately sealed his fate, leading directly to his trial and execution.
Furthermore, the monarchy could not rely on the loyalty of its own military forces, which was an essential condition for crushing any revolution. The lower ranks of the army, primarily composed of commoners and peasants, sympathized deeply with the revolutionary cause. When loyalist officers ordered their troops to fire on the mobs, as was attempted near the Bastille and the Hôtel des Invalides, the soldiers often refused to comply or actively defected to the popular side, notably the Gardes Françaises. This crucial military breakdown meant that the monarchy was rendered helpless. Without reliable instruments of repression, the crown and the aristocracy were defenseless against the organized will of the people and the decisive street power of the sans-culottes. The revolution was won in the streets and in the minds of the soldiers who refused to fight their own countrymen. The final stage of the revolution's success was forged through the escalating military and political crisis and the subsequent period known as the Reign of Terror. The War of the First Coalition, which saw all of France's neighbors invade or threaten invasion, was an existential threat, but it also served as a profound crucible. The direct and overwhelming threat of foreign invasion created a sense of national emergency that allowed the radical Jacobins and all-powerful Committee of Public Safety to seize near-dictatorial power. They successfully used the external crisis to ruthlessly purge moderate voices and consolidate absolute authority in Paris. The revolutionary government realized that only total national mobilization could save the Republic. The infamous terror, ruthless and brutal as it was, proved highly effective in two critical and undeniable ways. Firstly, it succeeded in suppressing all internal dissent, including the massive royalist revolt in the Vendée, which threatened to tear France apart, and the dangerous federalist rebellions across the provincial cities, thereby forcing the entire nation under centralized revolutionary control. This political unification under duress was crucial for survival. Secondly, the terror instituted the levée en masse, a radical and total mobilization of the nation's human and economic resources, a concept completely unheard of in 18th-century warfare. This measure created the massive, disciplined, and politically indoctrinated Revolutionary Army, a fighting force numbering nearly 1 million men.
This army not only successfully drove back the sophisticated foreign invaders, but decisively turned the tide of the war at critical junctures and literally saved the Republic from external destruction. The revolution had created an overwhelming military force based on merit and national devotion, a factor that gave France dominance in Europe for 2 decades. The end of the Terror, with the execution of Robespierre in the Thermidorian reaction, did not weaken the revolution, but rather allowed it to consolidate its military gains while purging its most extreme political elements. The Thermidorians dismantled the dictatorship of the CPS, but crucially, they kept the powerful army intact. The Republic now survived not through ideological purity, but through military strength and conquest. In conclusion, the French Revolution succeeded because the monarchy was fundamentally bankrupt, unable to solve the deep financial crisis due to the rigid immunity of the privileged elites. The ruling class was dangerously inflexible and short-sighted, refusing any necessary reform. The intellectual class provided a clear, compelling language for radical change that mobilized the bourgeoisie. Finally, the leadership of the Jacobins, in a moment of existential military crisis, proved ruthlessly effective in mobilizing the entire nation for total war and suppressing all internal and external opposition. The Ancien Regime collapsed under the weight of its own inertia and incompetence, paving the way for the establishment of the Republic, the creation of the unstoppable revolutionary army, and the ultimate rise of the military strongmen who would inherit those armies and exploit the resulting chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolution succeeded by surviving its own internal contradictions through sheer brute force and national mobilization, an act that changed power politics forever.